Hey, welcome everybody. We're very happy that so many of you turned out here today. We know it's one day from fall break and our Thanksgiving week, so we're really excited to have so many of you here. My name is Marcus Metzner. I'm the interim director of the Robertson School, and this is our final Robertson School Speaker Series event for the fall semester, and we're really excited to have Bob Levey here. I know you all will be in for a treat. Bob Levey was a visiting professor at the Robertson School in 2016, 2017, right at the last presidential election. I and some other faculty members in the school had talked to our classes multiple times. It was just fascinating to listen to Bob, so we're really excited to have you back. Also, a warm welcome to his wife, Jane, who's with him here today. We are in impeachment week again. If you look at the title, From Nixon to Trump, Bob and I actually planned this event. We talked about it in like February or March. We had no idea what we would be in late November, but he was in the Washington Post newsroom when the Nixon impeachment was happening, and so he will have a lot of experience and insights to share with us how we got to the point where we are this week and where we're going to go in the coming weeks. I want to keep it short and would like to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Jeff South. He's one of our senior journalism professors, and I couldn't think of anybody more suited to moderate the event here tonight. He has been at the Robertson School, may I say, for over 20 years, I think. And he's really built our journalism program. He ran our Capital News Service for over a decade and has really built it into a very ambitious program with more than 100 news clients that are now even reporting for the Associated Press and are making headlines nationwide. So couldn't think of anybody more suited to moderate this event, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Jeff.
So, Bob Levey has been doing journalism since age 6, when he launched the late lamented Levey's News, for which he was editor, publisher, columnist, and chief crayoner, Circulation 1. Bob was born in Manhattan, grew up in the Bronx. His diploma says he got a degree in English from the University of Chicago, which recently honored him as a distinguished alumni. But in fact, he majored in editing the student newspaper there. From Chicago, he went to the Albuquerque Tribune, and then on a visit to Washington, D.C. in 1967, applied for a job at the Post. At the Post, Bob went through a series of positions, from night cops and assistant city editor to Capitol Hill reporter and feature writer. In 1981, he was asked to write a daily column, so he wrote one, followed by 2,999 more. Over the course of 23 years, his column, Bob Levey's Washington, won awards, and Bob was repeatedly named one of the most popular columnists in Washington. Bob was a multimedia reporter before multimedia became cool. He worked in television and radio. He was once voted radio talk show host of the year in Washington, and he helped develop the WashingtonPost.com website. He's also written books, including with his wife Jane, a pictorial history of nation's capital, and most recently a novel, Larry Felder, Candidate, copies of which you can get here, but knowing most students, you'll probably check Amazon for half-price editions. After working at the Post for 36 years, Bob retired in 2004, but he has stayed busy as a professor and as a journalist. Among other things, he's been writing advance obituaries for the Washington Post. And that's an obit written about somebody who's still alive, but is kind of in, shall we say, heaven's waiting room. And the saying around Washington is that, well, Bob has written dozens of these obits, but it's been very rare that anyone he's written an obit about has died. And so the saying around Washington is that if you want to live forever, have Bob write your obit. In the Post newsroom, so Bob sat between Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein when those two reporters were exposing crimes and corruption by President Nixon during the Watergate scandal. Now, for journalists of a certain age, saying you sat next to Woodward and Bernstein, that's like saying you played bass for the Rolling Stones. And at this point, you can do an eye roll and say, okay, boomer. So seriously, the investigative reporting by Woodward and Bernstein is what inspired a lot of young people in the 1970s to go into journalism. It was a time, like now, when the United States was politically polarized and when certain politicians excoriated the press, just as Donald Trump does now. So that's what brings us here today for a discussion of From Nixon to Trump, Why Our Democracy Needs Strong Journalism. With that, folks, let's hear from our featured speaker and incomparable raconteur, Larry Felder. Bob Levey.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I am so delighted to be back here at VCU. So delighted to be back in the Student Center where I consume so many lunches, each in 2 minutes and 33 seconds. Sound familiar, students? And so delighted that I can stand before you having once again survived Interstate 95. If you do nothing else in the rest of your lives, I want you to fix that road because nobody who looks like me has or ever will. Wow, it's tough. As my colleagues know, when I spent my year here at VCU, I commuted almost all the time by train, which got me away from I-95, which gave me plenty of time to do some journalism, think about journalism, grade papers, get to know all the students here better by telephone, by email. It was a great year, and I'm glad to be back. And I'm especially glad to be back now, as Professor South said. I have been serving a life sentence in Washington, D.C. for a very long time. I'm in my 53rd year of living in Washington and working for the Washington Post. I've been in journalism across 10 presidents. I have watched the highs and the lows. I have been in the newsroom for many of them. And a lot of people want to know what it is like now under President Trump as compared with what it was like in the early 1970s when I sat between Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein during Watergate. Watergate is still widely considered the greatest achievement in the history of American journalism. I agree with that. I sat there and watched it happen. I was right between these guys every day as they reported these stories, wrote these stories, defended these stories to squadrons of editors who would come and look over our shoulders every day and look at what they were doing and say, in typical Ben Bradley fashion, I'll do his voice for you, okay? Woodward, you don't have it yet. He said that many days, and that only meant that Woodward, who was already working 18-hour days, would work 20-hour days to get the story of their lives. But it was also the story of your lives. And I think that's where I want to begin today by explaining to you that journalism is not an adversarial industry. It never has been. And even in situations where presidents of the United States are being impeached, remember there is a third too, Professor South, right in the middle between Nixon and Trump. President Bill Clinton was also impeached in 1999, 20 years ago. So Nixon was one bookend, Trump was another, Clinton was right in between the two of them. And in every case, the press was vilified by the president who was being impeached. In every case, the press was accused of bias, often very political. And in every case, I am happy to say, including notably today's case, there is no evidence of bias whatsoever. I cannot tell you how many times in my career I have had people come up to me, even now, even 46 years later, and say to me that the reason that the Washington Post went after the Watergate story was because that everybody who worked there was a closet member of the Democratic Party. Or they were just so anti-Richard Nixon because he was a Republican that they decided to take a whack at a Republican. None of this is new, ladies and gentlemen, and none of this is partisan. Any of you who have spent time in newsrooms know this. All of you who will spend time in newsrooms know this. The story is king. What I heard every day for years as I sat between Bob and Carl during Watergate was never get Nixon. What I heard every day was get the story. Get the story first, get it all, get it right, and get it in a way that it can never be challenged as far as accuracy is concerned. All of you who want to do journalism, I hope, will marvel at this achievement by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. The Watergate story went on for about 2.5 years from the moment that the Watergate break-in was discovered until President Nixon resigned on the verge of being removed from office. 2.5 years of some 275 daily stories, every one of them written on deadline, and at the absolute insistence of the editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley. He insisted that every one of these stories, because the stakes were so high, be double-sourced. That means that every piece of information in those stories had to have more than one source. Imagine how difficult that was. Because it wasn't as if you could just call somebody and say, hey, you know what? I'm writing a story about impeaching the President of the United States. Can you throw a log on the fire and help me do that, please? That's hardly the way the reporters functioned in that situation. Double sourcing stories meant that everybody at the Post knew how big the stakes were here, and they insisted on getting it right. Only twice in 275 stories across 2.5 years was anything ever found to be wrong in any of Woodward and Bernstein's journalism. That is a pretty terrific batting average, and I hope that it sets the table for tonight as we, of course, talk about the accusations of fake news by this president and the accusations of bias by President Clinton and the people around him 20 years ago. It betrays a certain fundamental misunderstanding of what journalism is all about. How many times in your lives, folks, have you heard people say about newspapers or TV and radio or websites or anything, oh, they're just doing that to sell newspapers? How many times have you heard that phrase? In fact, the truth about the economics of journalism, during each of these three impeachments, from Nixon to Trump, has always been, and still is, that newspapers get the biggest bang for their buck by doing their best work, not their worst. And so I want to challenge all of you as you read in this amazing welter of political news every day to understand not only what today's reporters are having to face, and their obstacles are just as great as anything faced by Woodward and Bernstein, but also the issues of where the truth actually lies and how much truth journalism can really deliver on deadline every day. I think the answer is a great deal, but I don't want you to think, as so many people do, that journalism is a perfect science. It is an art. The best it can ever do is get as close as possible to the truth as often as possible, and I think it does that very, very well. And when I say that, I want to give you two examples of how reporters are working in the era of Trump that remind me absolutely, almost in an eerie way, of what I watched Bob and Carl do 46 years ago. Some of the greatest journalism I have ever read or seen has been produced in the last 3 years during the Trump administration, during this barrage of accusations by the president that every story he doesn't like is fake news, during the amazing spectacle of the President of the United States going to rallies all over the United States. The press is now being penned up in a cage over to the side of these rallies, and routinely people egged on by the president will come over and directly threaten reporters right in their faces. This is a difficult working environment, to say the least. But what all of you need to understand is that despite these obstacles, and despite much more fundamental obstacles, the White House has not had a press briefing, a public briefing for the media in almost a year. The current press secretary to the President of the United States, who's been in the job some 5 months, I think, has never had a press briefing. That has never happened before. So what is a reporter to do in a situation like this? A reporter is working harder than ever, working in ways that may disturb some of you. They disturb me to some degree. If you cannot get your news and your information through the front door, which is what every reporter has always hoped to do, you have got to find some other way to do it. And for 3 years, I've been amazed at this, but almost every story about the Trump administration has been based on leaks. Do all of you understand what leaks are? They are providing information without a name attached to reporters, and the person providing the information doesn't want his name used for a number of reasons, usually because he wants his job the next day, but it can be for other reasons too. And this makes it very difficult for reporters to sort out which information is accurate and which information might be a trial balloon, which information might be trying to make the reporter look bad because it's false, which information is based on recent discussions with the president and not discussions two months ago. It's not an ideal way to cover anything, much less the president. But that is what has been going on for years now with this administration. And despite that, I want to point out 2 examples of some of the best reporting I have ever read, despite the fake news cries, despite the obstacles. I hope that all of you who are studying journalism here at the Robertson School will go back and look at these 2 examples and appreciate what reporters had to do to bring these stories to market and to have them stand the test of time, because they not only proved to be absolutely accurate, despite what the president accused them of being, but they both won Pulitzer Prizes. New York Times published the earliest, the best, and the most accurate coverage from the southern border about the separation of young children from their parents at the southern border. To say the least, this was not a situation that this administration wanted to have published. The Times, as it has been historically capable of doing, found the truth by interviewing people, interviewing more people. It's not magic, gang. You got to get out there with your pen and your pad and do the work. They did it. They had the resources to do it. They are a very, very big organization. They did it, and those 2 reporters, Peter Baker and Maggie Haberman, deservedly won a Pulitzer Prize. But in some ways, the Pulitzer Prize that the Washington Post won a year ago is a better example of what I'm talking about. There's an absolutely knockout reporter at the Washington Post named David Farenthold. Look up his stuff sometime. You know, when I left the Post 15 years ago, he was just coming on board as a summer intern. And I remember meeting him and talking to him and thinking, you know, this kid really could be somebody someday. Wow, is he somebody someday? The Trump Family Foundation just 10 days ago was found by a federal court in New York City to have violated a multitude of laws about the way family foundations are allowed to operate. The Family Foundation had done what's known as self-dealing. The Trumps, the father and his children are the board, had been removing money from this allegedly charitable organization and using it not only for his campaign, but for such purposes as commissioning an oil portrait of Donald Trump to hang in the lobby of one of his clubs in Florida. This is just manifestly illegal. How did David Fahrenthold get this story? He did not get it by magic or voodoo. He got it by going to Florida and interviewing everybody on the ground he could find. And he published the story about the portrait, and he won the Pulitzer Prize, and it led directly to the verdict that was handed down just a few days ago. There's much more that David has done. I think he will win a Pulitzer Prize again next year for his reporting on the staff at his golf club in New Jersey, where he has spent something like 40 weekends since being president. David, simply by going to the club and interviewing people, no voodoo, no magic, discovered that 80% of the people who work at this club are undocumented immigrants at Trump's own club. I don't have to explain the irony of that. I don't have to explain the news value of that. This is journalism that is going on now in the face of this kind of resistance and these kinds of accusations of fake news, fake news, fake news. This is journalism that's worth it. This is journalism that is excellent. This is journalism that is airtight. But I want all of you to understand that even though we're talking tonight about journalism from Nixon to Trump, and journalism in the context of impeachment, that there has never been a president who has been satisfied with his coverage. Way back when my hair was a much different color, I covered the White House of Lyndon Johnson. This is in the late 1960s. And Lyndon Johnson, for those of you who have never studied him, was a very folksy and bigger-than-life person from Texas. He was a large man. He was the kind of man who would come up and shake your hand, and you'd think that, I can't count the number of bones that this man has just broken in my hand by shaking my hand so hard. Lyndon Johnson once complained to me about a story that I did about him, and he did it in such a personal way. He did it within 1 inch of my nose. He was screaming and yelling at me. That's not the most pleasant thing that will ever happen to you, and it was not the most pleasant thing that ever happened to me. But you will notice that we're not talking tonight about Lyndon Johnson, or about the Bushes, or about Jimmy Carter, or about Gerald Ford, or about any other president. We could be, because that's the point I want to leave with you. That it is not just in the cloud of impeachment that presidents find it difficult to accept the journalism that is written about them and broadcast about them. It is all the time. It goes right to the question of what you're studying here at the Robertson School, which is, what is objectivity? Is it possible? Is it common? What do you do if somebody really has a complaint about unfair coverage? There is no court that will adjudicate this except if you get involved in a libel or a slander case, and most of the time it doesn't get that far. Most of the time it is simply this unholy relationship between reporter and source, between reporters who are there trying to do the best job they can, and politicians who have egos, who have careers, who have ambitions. Washington, D.C. is full of a lot of politicians. A lot of them are not the president. But as the joke goes, and I'm not sure this is such a joke, there are 100 members of the United States Senate, and there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. That's 535 people who basically run our country. And the joke in Washington, ha, 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 is that all 535 wake up every morning and look in the mirror and see a future president. That's how much the ego runs in the aisles up there, and that poses particular problems for reporters who do not want to destroy careers simply for the sake of destroying careers. We know a lot that we do not publish. We know a lot that we do not broadcast. And the reason we don't publish it and broadcast it is that in many cases, it does not stand the test of good editing. And good editing should depend on complete fairness, as close to objectivity as you can ever get, and the ability to look the person in the eye the next day and say, you know what, this isn't a favorable story about you, but I want you to understand that it is a fair story about you. Much, much later, Bill Clinton, who was impeached but not convicted, let it be known to some people at the Washington Post that when they covered his response to the allegations that were all over the place in 1999, that he'd had a sexual affair with a young intern in the Oval Office, among other places. He denied it at the time. He lied to the television cameras at the time. 5 years later, in a quiet moment, he got some of those reporters aside and he said, you know what? It was the truth. It was the truth. Now, where does this leave all of you, and where does this leave journalism? I wish I could tell you that whatever happens in the current impeachment drama, that journalism will come out on the other side of the sausage machine whole. I cannot promise you that, but I can certainly promise you two things. One is that this tension between elected officials and journalists is not going anywhere anytime soon. And I will also promise you that the ability to write accurately about politics at all, not just about impeachment, is threatened every day by the enormous differences today as opposed to 1999 and 1973. And a lot of those differences are right here in this little machine, right here. When Richard Nixon was impeached, there was no Fox News, there was no Twitter, there was no internet. When Bill Clinton was impeached in 1999, Fox News was founded that year. There was no Twitter. The internet was not ubiquitous. You could not walk down the street in downtown Richmond and see people doing this one after the other. The internet was a bit rare. Handheld devices were very expensive and very rare. This is only 20 years ago. So the challenges of journalism in 2019 have to do tremendously with electronics, with social media, and with the business consequences that I know all of you are studying so hard at the Robertson School. And if you're not, you better be, because that's where this whole discussion is. How do you fairly cover somebody if you are not the Washington Post and you are not the New York Times? Because all of you know this from your own lives, the difference between objective journalism, the kind of work that Woodward and Bernstein did, the kind of work that Baker and Haberman did at the Times, the kind of work that David Farenthold did at the Post, gets to be more and more difficult because the internet does not allow for the distinction that supported their journalism between objective reporting and opinion. There used to be an absolutely distinct, bright red line between those two parts of journalism. There is not today. Many people think that anything that is on the internet is just as true as anything else. They don't worry about how the journalism is edited or curated or reported. They just say, well, hey, there it is, it must be true. I hope that all of you will bear in mind that it is not true, that unless you do the work yourselves to dig in about the parentage of the journalism that you're studying and reading, you are going to make the same mistake that millions of people make every day, which is to assume that it doesn't really matter whether certain kinds of opinion journalism are tinged with opinion, or certain kinds of journalism is stolen from other sources, or sources are hijacked and repeated as happens every day online. I hope that you will be discerning consumers of journalism, and of course that you will support the best journalism. Because I could go on for an hour and a half about the business challenges in the world of journalism. They are huge. They are getting huger by the day. They're not going away. But I want everyone in this room to understand something, and that is this, that the power to define where journalism is going is among you, not among the likes of me. So often people think, and I'm sure it's true of a lot of you, that they're helpless babies on a beach somewhere, and here comes this jet bomber that's raining journalism down on the unsuspecting masses on the beach from 30,000 feet. You're all defenseless against this onslaught of journalism. You got to take what we give you. You don't have to take what we give you. You have the cards here. You have the power here. If you're willing to support the best journalism, it will survive. If you're not, if the only thing you're going to look up on the web is listicles and sugar-coated nonsense and bias, that is what you will get. And I cannot even begin to imagine where we're going to be as a country and as a society if you cannot trust certain sources of news. Sure, you can trust certain things online. I am not saying that you can't. I'm only saying you're going to have to work harder than you've ever worked before to understand where the wheat is and where the chaff is. In 1973, when Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein did this story about Watergate, they owned the story without any competition for more than 8 weeks. Just think about that. Do you think anything like that would be possible today? If Watergate happened today, if there were a break-in on Virginia Avenue in Washington, D.C. today, how soon do you think that story would be on the web? How soon do you think zillions of people would be covering it? You'd never even know the names of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. So understand that social media and the internet giveth, social media and the internet taketh away, but you are the ultimate referees here. You can demand good journalism. You can demand it in every way and every day, and I hope you will. But I also hope that you will understand that journalism has brought us lots of good news, both in the Nixon world, in the Clinton world, and in the Trump world. It goes this way every day. It's a hardworking world out there. These people are part of that hardworking world, and I think they're doing as good a job as they did 47 years ago, even though the lay of the land is completely different. Before I close, I want to tell you a little bit about my book, which is sitting here and which Professor Messner has so graciously allowed me to discuss for a little bit. Washington is in my bones, and I decided a couple of years ago that I wanted to do a book about Washington journalism and also Washington politics wrapped together. And so I have. The book is called Larry Felder Candidate. It's a novel. But it's a very realistic novel. This is not one of those books that's all about, oh my gosh, the president's plane is missing, or some commando jumped the White House fence, or something like that. Nothing like that. Larry Felder is a famous Washington columnist who abandons journalism to run for Congress in the Washington suburbs. And before you ask, no, 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 no. I am never abandoning journalism. I am not running for Congress or for anything else. I ran for the student council in the 6th grade and I lost, and it was so devastating that I've never run for anything again. So no, Larry is not me and I am not Larry, but if you are interested in a book that will really teach you about how the sausage is made in both sausage factories, congressional campaigns, big-time Washington journalism, and how these two worlds intersect and collaborate. The book is here. It'll be for sale once I'm done. And my wife Jane will be selling copies, and I'll be right beside her, right over here, signing them for you if you would like. And I hope you would like. I'd be happy to take your questions now about absolutely anything, about the book, about my career, about what I've said, about what I have not said. And I want to just say thanks again to my colleagues here at the Robertson School for making this go. I had just a wonderful year here 2 years ago, and I miss it. And the only people who miss it more than me are the bean counters at Amtrak, who don't know what to do with their open trains now that I'm not on them. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, now Professor South is going to run the microphone up to whoever has a question so we can all hear it. I'm happy to take questions for as long as you like. I know a lot of you have to go to class at 7, so you're excused in advance if you got to go for the door. Who's got a question?
We've got one from Bill Oglesby.
Yes, sir. I know that guy.
Bob, I'm wondering, since you were as close to the sort of center of investigative journalism when the Nixon impeachment was being investigated.
Yes.
What do you see as the difference today in what you're seeing so far coming out of Congress, and do you attribute that at all to the changes in the media, as you talked about, the great proliferation of social media we have today?
I do, absolutely, Bill, and I think the difference is Twitter. The President of the United States is one of the most prolific tweeters who has ever lived. He tweets at 3 in the morning, he tweets at 7 in the morning, and as you saw just the other day, he tweets in real time as certain witnesses were appearing before the House of Representatives. That was never possible in 1999 or 1973. So yeah, I think there's a big difference there. And I also think there's an enormous echo chamber that develops thanks to the internet, where even the strangest reactions to things, even the most fringy takes on things, can be amplified and spread on the internet in seconds, and that could never happen before. And they take on a life of their own. They take on a currency and a validity that they would never have had if they had to wait till the next morning and had to wait for some newspaper editor to sort out what was truth and what was not. So yeah, last night in the Democratic debates, this question came up and I sat up straight. They said, what do you think is going to happen to the whole Twitter universe once Donald Trump is not president anymore? And the answer kind of drifted off into space, but here's my answer. Twitter is here. Twitter is going to be one of the ways that presidents communicate from now on, and communicate over newspaper reporters and editors. They no longer need to have press conferences. They no longer do. They can just tweet, tweedly-dee, tweet. Who's next?
Yeah. Do you think there's a place for feminism in journalism, specifically Washington journalism?
Well, I think there's a place for women, and my gosh, the difference between when I started and today is astonishing. The day I walked into the Washington Post on October 2nd, 1967, the staff was about 140 people, and there were 4 women. How many of those 4 women do you think covered serious, big-time, high-production beats? 0. Today, more than half the staff is female. More than half the editing staff is female. The editor is a man, and the 2 managing editors are men, but there has been previously a female managing editor, and there will certainly be an executive editor someday who is a woman. Now, if you mean by feminism a coloration of the journalism that the Post does, I hope there never will be that, because I don't think the journalism should be colored at all. I think a female reporter should do journalism in the same objective way that a male reporter does it. If you want to talk about opinion and op-eds and editorials, that's something else again. There, I think the voice of columnists and editorial writers can be themed according to feminism, but I would never be in favor of that, and I hope I never see it in the news columns. Right here.
So in the answer to the first question that someone asked you said that the government doesn't really need to do press conferences anymore. I was wondering if you think that that's beneficial, if press conferences would be beneficial to
I think
the
they'd
White
be
House.
very beneficial, because how else can you gather the acorns that you need to gather as a reporter? You can't be a good squirrel as a reporter unless you can get information, and getting information means access. It means gathering acorns from as wide a field as possible. If you are covering the White House, and the White House will not ever submit to an open-ended question from you, everybody loses, including your readers. The journalism just cannot stand up to the tests of objectivity and depth that it needs to stand up to, as well as it could if there were regular press conferences. Yes.
Hi, my name is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. My name is Erica Mogan. I want to say thank you, first of all, for coming here. My question to you is, what is your best advice for students just starting out wanting to be an investigative reporter?
Oh, Erica, how much time you got?
I have so much time.
Okay. First of all and foremost, do not let anybody take your dream away from you. Of course it's going to be difficult out there. And I will bet you right now that as hard as you may try, you're not going to have one linear career with one newspaper for 53 years the way I have. That should never deter you from pursuing this. Let me tell you a story, because this happened to me a couple of years ago. The real enemy here, gang, is parents who want security for their kids, who want them to be in first jobs, second jobs, third jobs that are safe, 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 capital S. This really happened to me, Erica. Jane and I were at a cocktail party, and this guy comes up to me. I didn't know him. Are you Bob Levey? You worked at the Post? Yes, I am. He takes out his phone and he says, my daughter is a senior at the University of Michigan, and she's a photographer for the Michigan Daily, and she wants to do photojournalism, and he hands me the phone and says, here, talk her out of it right now. Talk her out of it right now. Wow. I refused to do it, thereby, not for the first time in my life, bringing a cocktail party to a screeching halt, but that's where parents are about this. They don't get it about you, Erica, but I get it about you. So pursue it, work hard at it, be ready to work hard at it, be ready to do more than one thing, and be ready to have a series of jobs, particularly in your 20s, that will lead you to a job that you've always wanted. You know, in my day, there was a big kerfuffle around the world of folk music. In the early 1960s, there was a guy named Bob Dylan, whom I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, who couldn't sing at all, but he made millions of hit records and he was terrific. And one day he came out with his guitar, and he had a drum set in front of him with a foot pedal, and he had a mouth rack with a harmonica in it, and he would sing and do all three of the instrumental accompaniments at the same time. And everybody said, oh, this is an abomination, you know, can't he just sing? Can't he just... No, he thought that he made better music by doing many things at once. You're going to need to be that person. The mouth rack, the drums, the guitar, the singing. You're going to need to know how to cut tape. You're going to need to know how to write HTML. You're going to need to know what objective sources are. Don't let that put you off, because this is the greatest business in the world. We need you, so go for it.
Thank you.
And when you make your first record and I hear you playing the harmonica, I'll know it's you, okay? Okay. Right here.
How do you think the power of data journalism has evolved regarding the amount of information that is public nowadays on the internet?
Well, there is a lot of data journalism. There's a lot of data that's available. I guess we could argue all night about what is the more amazing invention in our lifetimes. Is it the internet or is it Google? Google is absolutely astonishing. You know, I was writing my next book the other day, and I wanted to look up something about an obscure blues singer. And I just typed in this person's name, and in 1/2 a second, I got all the information I could ever want, not only about the singer, but here are clips of his music. Wow! So there's a lot of data out there. I think it opens the doors to more and better journalism, but it still depends on you. Because everybody can open Google and collect this data. What happens then? That is up to you to learn how to process and to handle accurately. And that's the difference in some ways between what is really suspect on the web and what is not. You know, the internet is like a raging river. Cars are floating down the river, trees are floating down the river, and every once in a while something nice is floating down the river, and it's up to you to figure out what's the car and what's the nice. So yeah, I mean, data is good, data is wonderful, and data is essential, but you're even more essential. More questions? Over here.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Really appreciate some of the work that you've done.
Thank you.
My name's Cal Weinstein. I'm a journalism student here. Last month, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, more commonly referred to as ISIS, killed himself after being pursued by United States Special Forces, responsible for untold amounts of bloodshed. Baghdadi also released videos of beheadings, as well as instructions for men on how to rape women and take them as their wives. The very next day, the Washington Post published an obituary that within the headline referred to al-Baghdadi as an austere religious scholar. The headline was changed after it sparked widespread criticism. So my question is, how can readers trust established outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times if they use harsher words against the president than they do in writing about one of the world's most evil terrorists? If you can concede that biased reporting takes place inside these established outlets like the Post, then what would you say would be the best way to go about fixing problems like these?
Thank you for an excellent question, and you've answered your own question. The reason you should trust these newspapers is that they are willing to correct an error like this, and did right away. Did within an hour, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was the time frame there. We make mistakes. We make them all the time. We will always make them. The issue is whether we own up to them and whether we really try to be balanced over a period of time, not just on one headline, not just on one story. I happen to agree that that original headline was way off the mark, but listen to what really happened there. You just said it. There was an elastic conversation between the editors and the consumers of that headline, and guess what? It got changed. That is what we want in our press, I think. That is what we have at big-time journalism. It's not what you have everywhere, but the fact that they did not say, we stand by our story and we're not going to fix the headline and we're not going to have you tell us to fix our headline because it's our headline, you didn't hear any of that. So rest easy, sleep tight. There are editors who really do listen, and that's an excellent example of why editors need to listen and do listen.
Bob, building on that question.
Yes.
Do you think journalism today has more of a trustworthiness problem than it did during the Watergate days?
Way more, and part of the problem is what I alluded to a minute ago, Jeff, and that's the blurring of the line between opinion journalism and fact journalism. Sometimes it's hard even for graybeards like me who really know how the cookie is built and crumbles to determine which is which. If big news organizations are not going to take this distinction seriously, you won't take it seriously, and that just leads to endless trouble. Even in the so-called softer sections, there's a lot of dispute about this. How do you write accurately about without injecting your own view or your own opinion into stories about athletes who misbehave? How do you write stories about people in show business who misbehave without seeming to be judge and jury, without seeming to inject your own opinion in there about a particular actor or a television show or a baseball team? It is a really difficult line to draw, but the line has to be drawn. It was drawn so sharply when I started in journalism. Not now. It's not drawn sharply now at all. And again, you can help that line survive by being careful about what you consume and where you consume it, how often you consume it, and why you consume it. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you make the point about us needing to choose what we consume.
Right.
But I feel like to this audience, it's kind of a bit like preaching to the choir. The people in this room were well aware of a lot of issues.
I hope so.
What do we do for people who don't?
And I know I sound like a commercial for the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Only $9.95, for your 1 month trial. That isn't what I meant. I meant that I'm not sure that even in this audience, all those lessons are so clear.
Okay.
I think that in this audience, there is a default to a lot of sugar-coated journalism, a lot of quickie stuff, a lot of tweets and retweets. I'll just tell you a story. The last class that I taught here at VCU, on the first day, the class was called Problems of Modern Journalism. And I went around the room and I said, okay, we're going to start by finding out where you journalism majors get your news. And this young guy sitting next to me said, well, I get all my news from Twitter. I get all my news from my friends who retweet stuff to me on Twitter. And I said, okay, you're sitting right next to me for the whole rest of the semester. And he was nice about it. I said, I just make you my private whipping boy here, and I'm going to make you an example of why you need to go bigger than this and better than this. So I can tell you from my own experience in this population that even journalism majors will default to what's easy and fast and kind of tasty. More questions? Yes, sir, in the center here.
I know you've discussed a lot of the cons to like Twitter and mass info sharing on social media. Do you think there's any like possible pros to how easily information can be spread?
There is the biggest pro in the history of this business, and let's talk business for a minute. Whoever decides that they're going to get this right about the internet building an information and news business is going to be a transformative figure. No one has figured it out yet. No one has figured out how to get your arms around an audience and a kind of journalism on the internet and make it pay and make it sustainable. When that happens, that's the answer to your question. When that happens, it could never have happened and will never happen without the internet. You know, 40 years ago, I used to go to meetings at the Washington Post and they would bring in the top executives from the circulation department. I really remember this. And they would sit there and say, well, you know, we gained 170 subscribers last week in Fairfax County, Virginia. And everybody would say, wow, hey, wow, 170 subscribers. Do you have any idea what the numbers look like on the internet? It is absolutely mind-boggling. One story for you, and I'll just, again, I don't have enough time to explain all the ins and outs of this, but where are we? We're in November. In September, WashingtonPost.com, which, as you heard, I was on the planning committee of way back when. In September, WashingtonPost.com got 80 million unique visitors. A unique visitor is somebody who goes directly to a website. That means they really want to go there. 80 million people. One of my grandfathers ran a men's clothing store in Syracuse, New York, and if that old buzzard had ever gotten 80 million people in the door of his store in 1 month, he would have been in Palm Beach a long time ago. Despite the 80 million, WashingtonPost.com lost money in September. The reason is that it cannot sell the ads, it cannot hold the audience, it cannot build a wall around the content that will keep other people away. Yeah, there's kind of a paywall there, kind of, and other websites have kind of a paywall, but the people that create this news and this website are expensive, they like eating, they like roofs over their heads, they like to send their kids to college. It's a very difficult business problem, and the problem is the internet, the solution is the internet, and it's going to be somebody your age, not my age, who solves this. And when this happens, you're going to hear me cheering from up above because this has to happen. It will happen. I just don't know what the shape of it'll be. One more question or two?
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think what I'm curious about is you were saying in the past 3 years, almost all of the information that investigative journalists have been receiving about the current administration is through leaks. Do you think that with the come of the next administration, this will go back to the way it was with press conferences?
Well, it depends on who the next president is, and if you
Right.
can tell me who that is, I'm going to be the greatest journalist in history. I can't tell you who that's going to be, but yeah, I think it'll go back to more normal because I think the people understand that this is to their benefit. This
Right.
is not just about making journalists happy, it's about making you happy, you the consumers of journalism. So it's a transactional business. We exist only to serve you. I mean, that sounds blissful and naive, and I don't mean it to be, but yeah, I think there's going to be a more regular series of press conferences. I think the next president will be available much more often than this one has been. This one is available for chunks of a minute and a half as he's about to get on a helicopter where you can barely hear the guy. That is not quite what we're used to. I mean, John F. Kennedy, who was president when I was a teenager, had a press conference every single week for his entire administration, as well as private interviews arranged through his staff in the Oval Office for individual reporters. It was part of the deal. This is understood. Will we go all the way back to that? I don't know. I think it'll depend on the person, but yes, we're heading that way. One more?
My name is AJ. And do you think we will ever find another solution besides a paywall to fund newspapers, organizations?
Great question. The question is, do I think there'll ever be another solution other than paywalls? Not soon, no. I mean, there are a lot of ideas thrown around about the future of the press. Should there be public financing of the press? Should philanthropies contribute to the press? And what about ownership by extremely rich individuals? The Washington Post was sold a little over 6 years ago to the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos. What do you think about that? Well, here's what's working about that. Bezos has said, do not bend in my direction in any way. You will cover Amazon and me exactly the way you did the day before we bought it. And he's just a dream come true. But the next guy who's real rich, who buys the Richmond Times-Dispatch or who buys the New York Times or something, may not be quite as committed to the basic values of journalism. That's scary.
But we won't get anything like when I grew up, you could put in a quarter and get a newspaper. Do you think we'll ever get anything like that in the internet again?
No, I don't. I think you will be able to subscribe, and you can today. But print journalism is going away. I wish I could be more optimistic about it. I think you're going to be very hard-pressed to find an ink-on-paper daily newspaper in 5 years. I think they're going to go away. And the economics all scream this. So I can't say, as I'd like to be able to say, that there's something wonderful and magical about picking up a piece of paper with ink on it. I mean, I still get a thrill out of this. I go out to my front door in my pajamas, and it's 6:30 in the morning, and I open the door, and there it is. The miracle. The miracle is there. I never feel that way when I turn on the computer. That's a miracle too. But as a business problem, I don't see an immediate way to deal with this other than sharper paywalls. And of course, the backside of that is the minute you build a really tight paywall, you chase people away.
But it was more so towards like, would I be able to, let's say, pay a nickel to read a paper on my phone for that day?
Sure, that's coming too. And that's coming to you from Facebook very soon. That very model is coming. You will be able to not only choose certain stories from a menu on Facebook, you will be able to, it'll be like a parking meter. You'll be able to put in $1 and you'll get a certain amount of time on Facebook. And for those of you who think that this is all about the New York Times and the Post, it's not. Facebook is about to be in the journalism business. They kind of are now. They're going to go all the way over there. There's going to be a fee sharing and content sharing arrangement with the big newspapers and the big TV networks. That was announced about a month ago. But you are still going to be able to do exactly what you said. Exactly what you said. Just think of the parking meter analogy and you're going to be there. Should we take one more? Sure, we got time. Anybody else? Over here. Then I just want to remind you that we'll be down in the front here. Books will be available, and happy to sign your book for you. And by the way, humbly, he says, the book would be a great choice for everybody on your Christmas list. There he said it. See, humbly. Yes.
Yes, sir. I'd like to get your opinion on the objectivity of the press.
Yes.
A journalist, referring to Jim Acosta, CNN.
Yes.
He goes to the White House press conferences, and he's obviously made up his own mind prior to asking the question, for example, the wall. So that's not really objective, but would he be willing to correct if he's wrong?
Sure,
He's
and he has
thrown
done
out
that.
of the
He has
the
done
White
that.
House.
But you're confusing whether he is objective with whether he is simply asking a provocative question. Sure, he made up his mind to ask that question ahead of time. Any good reporter would. That's called preparation. You prepared in your career, I prepared in mine. That's what Acosta does.
It seemed a little extreme. He was practically barred from the White House.
He was not practically barred, he was barred.
Well, he was let back in.
The issue, I think, sir, is not whether he asked an aggressive question, because he obviously did. The issue was not whether he asked a question that was right into the cavity in Donald Trump's tooth. He knew he was doing that, and you knew he was doing that. The issue is whether Acosta went to work that day and said, I am going to be an unobjective reporter carrying water for another political party or for some candidate or for some think tank or for some money person. He doesn't do that.
But he's very consistent. I have never seen him to be objective. He's very consistent on his
He is consistently provocative.
Okay.
That's what we do. Do you want us not to ask tough questions?
No, but I mean,
well, that's
it
all he's doing.
appears to me.
No, okay. I mean, eye of the beholder, and I understand that, and I respect that. But I have seen reporters who are far less objective than Jim Acosta. They will go in there with when did you stop beating your wife questions. You know, not so much with Trump, but with other people. President Bush, didn't you know in your heart of hearts that when you invaded the Middle East in Desert Storm 2, that you would be murdering innocent little children? You know, that's the kind of question that I think raises objectivity issues and I'm trying to embarrass you issues rather than I'm trying to get an answer in a world that's a very controversial world. How do you ask about the wall without being provocative? By definition, it's provocative.
Very extremely aggressive to where
he is
he's
aggressive.
Practically
he is
led
aggressive.
out of the place.
I mean, you're old enough, I think, to remember a reporter for ABC News named Sam Donaldson. You remember him? He was, yeah, Big Sam. He was aggressive. He was aggressive with a capital A. Nobody ever thought this about him. That's how we do the job. The more you stand in the schoolhouse door and say, you know, we're not going to answer that question, we're not going to take it seriously, that's a little like waving the red flag in front of the bull. Okay.
Cool.
Are we done?
I think we should wrap up. Kind
Okay.
of like print journalism has seen the end of its days coming. Maybe this session has as well.
I think this session has as well.
So thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you all. Come on down, let's talk books.